Chapter 1. A Message at the Central Cafe. The fog that rolled off the River Mersey on the evening of Monday the 19th of January 1931, carried the familiar, biting chill of a Liverpool winter. It crept through the cobblestone streets of Anfield, smudging the gaslights into sickly yellow halos and slicking the pavements with a greasy film of moisture. For William Herbert Wallace, a man of precise habits and frail constitution, the weather was an inconvenience to be endured with stoic resignation. Clutching his worn leather briefcase tightly against his heavy overcoat, Wallace stepped off the tramcar and made his way toward the city center. At 52 years of age, he was a strikingly unremarkable figure. Tall, painfully thin, and slightly stooped, he possessed the hollow cheeks and pale complexion of a man who spent his life under the dim glare of gas lamps and the weight of other people's financial anxieties. For 16 years, he had walked the same terraced streets as an agent for the Prudential Assurance Company, collecting pennies and shillings from working-class households, a human pendulum swinging between the twin realities of poverty and respectability. Yet tonight was not a night for insurance ledgers. Tonight was a night for chess. The Liverpool Chess Club met in the basement of the Central Cafe in North John Street, a subterranean sanctuary where the clamor of the industrial port city died away, replaced by the quiet clicking of wooden pieces and the low, intense murmur of analytical minds. As Wallace descended the stairs, the warmth of the room, thick with the scent of pipe tobacco, roasted coffee beans, and damp wool, washed over him. He felt an immediate loosening in his chest. Here, on the 64 squares of the board, life was orderly, logical, and entirely subject to predictable rules. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic world outside, and perhaps more poignantly, to the quiet, stifling atmosphere of his home at 29 Wolverton Street. Wallace hung his coat and hat on a peg, adjusted his spectacles, and scanned the room. The club's tournament was well underway. He was scheduled to play a match against a formidable opponent, and he looked forward to the intellectual distraction. He was setting up his pieces when Samuel Beattie, the club's captain, approached him. Beattie was a man of businesslike demeanor, but his expression carried a flicker of mild curiosity as he tapped Wallace on the shoulder. "Ah, Wallace," Beattie said, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of the cafe. "You've just missed a telephone call. A message was left for you about half an hour ago." Wallace looked up, a pawn poised between his thumb and forefinger. He felt a minor prickle of surprise. It was highly unusual for anyone to call him at the club. His domestic life with his wife, Julia, was intensely private, almost reclusive. They kept few friends, and his professional clients certainly did not know his recreational whereabouts. "A phone call, Mr. Beattie?" Wallace asked, his voice thin and precise. "From whom?" "A gentleman calling himself Qualtrough," Beattie replied, squinting slightly as he recalled the details. "R.M. Qualtrough." He sounded like a man of some education, rather distinct voice. "He said it was a matter of business." "Qualtrough." Wallace repeated the name, turning it over in his mind. The syllables felt foreign, entirely unfamiliar. "I don't believe I know anyone by that name. Are you quite sure it was for me?" "Oh, he was most specific," Beattie said, pulling a small slip of paper from his waistcoat pocket. "He asked for you by name. When I told him you hadn't arrived yet, he asked me to take a message. He wants you to call at his house tomorrow evening. Tuesday, at 7:30. Beattie handed the slip of paper to Wallace. Written in Beattie's neat hand was an address, 25 Menlove Gardens West. Wallace stared at the paper. Menlove Gardens, that is out in Mossley Hill, is it not? A substantial distance from Anfield. Indeed, Beattie nodded. The gentleman stated that he wishes to discuss an insurance policy. Something about a valuable endowment for his daughter. He was quite insistent that you come at that exact time, as he has to leave for a business trip shortly afterward. Wallace frowned slightly, his analytical mind already calculating the logistics. Mossley Hill was an affluent suburb, a world away from the cramped terraces he usually patrolled. A wealthy client looking for a significant endowment policy was an opportunity no insurance agent could afford to ignore, especially in these lean economic times. The commission on such a policy could secure his and Julia's comfort for months. "Well," Wallace murmured, tucking the note into his waistcoat. "It is most mysterious. I have absolutely no recollection of a Mr. Qualtrough. But business is business. I suppose I shall have to make the journey tomorrow." "Best of luck with it," Beatty said with a brief smile before drifting away to attend to another match. Wallace sat back down at his board, but the serene focus he usually commanded had been fractured. The name Qualtrough seemed to echo faintly in his thoughts, a discordant note in his otherwise harmonious routine. Who was this man? How did he know Wallace would be at the Central Cafe on this specific Monday evening? The club's schedule was public knowledge among its members, of course, but Wallace was a casual player, not an enthusiast who attended every single gathering. He shook his head, clearing the fog of speculation, and forced his attention back to the wooden pieces before him. His opponent had arrived, and the game began. For the next 2 hours, Wallace immersed himself in the silent warfare of positions, knights leaping over pawns, rooks anchoring lines of defense. He played well, his mind sharp, eventually securing a respectable draw. By the time Wallace left the Central Cafe, the city had grown even colder. The tram ride back to Anfield was a monotonous blur of dark streets and shivering passengers. When he finally walked down Wolverton Street, the row of identical red brick terraces looked like a silent garrison under the winter sky. He unlocked the door to number 29 and stepped into the narrow hallway. The house was quiet, smelling faintly of linseed oil and coal smoke. Julia was waiting for him in the morning room, huddled near the fire with a shawl wrapped tightly around her frail shoulders. She was several years older than he, a woman of faded refinement who found the harsh realities of Liverpool life difficult to bear. Her health had been failing of late, and she spent much of her time playing the piano or reading in isolation. "William?" she asked, her eyes turning toward him as he entered. "You were late tonight." "A good game, my dear," Wallace said gently, removing his coat. He walked over and kissed her forehead. "And a most peculiar occurrence." He sat opposite her and drew the slip of paper from his pocket, holding it out to her. "A man rang the chess club tonight. A Mr. R. M. Qualtrough. He wishes me to visit him tomorrow evening at an address in Mossley Hill to discuss an endowment. 25 Menlove Gardens West." Julia examined the note, her brow furrowing. "Qualtrough. What an odd name. I don't recall you ever mentioning such a client." "Because I have never heard of him," Wallace said, staring into the dying embers of the hearth. "But he seemed to know exactly where to find me. It is a long journey for a Tuesday night, but if the policy is as substantial as he implies, it will be well worth the effort." Julia handed the note back, her expression clouded by a vague, unspoken anxiety. "Be careful, William. The city is not safe after dark these days." "Nonsense, my dear," Wallace replied with a reassuring smile. "It is merely a business consultation in one of the finest neighborhoods in Liverpool. What could possibly go wrong?" As they prepared for bed, the small house fell into a deep, heavy silence. In the dark, Wallace lay awake for a short while, his mind tracing the unfamiliar map of Mossley Hill, entirely unaware that the name written on the scrap of paper in his waistcoat was the first thread of a web that was already tightening around him. Chapter 2. The Tuesday Routine. The morning of Tuesday the 20th of January 1931, broke with the same dreary, overcast sky that had hung over Liverpool for days. Inside 29 Wolverton Street, the day began with the rigid, clockwork precision that defined William Herbert Wallace's existence. He awoke early, dressing in his charcoal grey suit, which, though showing signs of wear at the cuffs, was meticulously brushed. Downstairs in the kitchen, the air was cold until William lit the coal range. Julia joined him shortly after, her pale face framed by silvering hair. She moved with a delicate, almost ghostly slowness, wrapped in her thick knitted shawl. Their interaction was a dance of quiet familiarity. They were a couple who spoke little but understood each other's silences perfectly. After 16 years of marriage without children, their world had shrunk to the perimeter of this small terraced house and each other's company. "You look tired, William," Julia remarked as she poured the tea. Her voice carried the faint, clipped accent of her upbringing in the South, a reminder of a life before the damp northern air had taken hold of her lungs. "A slight headache, nothing more," William replied, adjusting his spectacles. The tram ride last night was exceptionally draughty. I shall be fine once I am moving. He spent the morning hours at the dining table, surrounded by his Prudential Assurance ledger books. To an outsider, the columns of names, addresses, and tiny sums of money, threepence here, a shilling there, would look mind-numbing. To Wallace, it was a map of human survival. He knew which families were one illness away from missing a payment, and which ones would hide behind the curtains when he knocked. He took pride in his exactness. Every penny was accounted for, every receipt stamped with mathematical certainty. By mid-afternoon, William prepared to leave for his regular collection route. Before he departed, he turned his thoughts to the mysterious evening appointment. He walked over to the small bookshelf in the morning room and pulled out his official Liverpool tramway guide and a city street map. Finding Menlove Gardens West proved to be an unexpected puzzle. His eyes traced the suburbs of Mossley Hill. He found Menlove Avenue easily enough. Branching off it were Menlove Gardens East, Menlove Gardens South, and Menlove Gardens North. He peered closer, his finger hovering over the ink lines. He searched the interlocking streets for several minutes, but Menlove Gardens West was nowhere to be found. An omission by the mapmakers, no doubt, Wallace muttered to himself. He was not unduly worried. Liverpool was expanding rapidly, and new developments often outpaced the printers. He knew the general district well enough to assume that if East, North, and South existed, West must simply be a newer avenue in the same cluster. At approximately 4 o'clock, he left the house to complete his afternoon insurance collections in Anfield. The work was routine, a blur of heavy oak doors, narrow entryways, and brief, polite exchanges with housewives. By the time he returned to Wolverton Street at 6 o'clock, the gas lamps were being lit along the street, casting long, shivering shadows across the brickwork. Julia had prepared a light high tea of scones and tea. As they sat together in the morning room, William checked his pocket watch. It was a silver timepiece, kept perfectly regulated. "I must leave by 6:45, he told Julia, setting down his teacup. "The journey to Mossley Hill requires 2 separate trams. If I am to meet this Mr. Qualtrough by 7:30, I cannot afford any delays." Julia looked out the window into the gathering gloom. The fog from the previous night had cleared, but the air remained bitterly cold and sharp. "I do not like you going all that way for a stranger, William. Especially when you cannot find the exact street on the map. It is a wealthy district, my dear," William reassured her, standing up to put on his boots. "Bank managers, merchants, and shipping clerks live out there. Mr. Qualtrough is likely a man of means who wishes to secure his family's future. It is precisely the kind of business I have been hoping for." He walked into the hallway and reached for his heavy overcoat and his black bowler hat. Julia followed him, holding his woolen scarf. She wrapped it gently around his neck, her fingers lingering for a moment on his lapel. "Will you be late returning?" she asked, her dark eyes reflecting the dim gaslight of the hall. "I should think I will be back by 9, or shortly thereafter," he said. He leaned down and kissed her cheek. "Do not stay up in the cold. Keep the fire lit in the morning room and rest your chest." "Goodbye, William," she said softly. Wallace opened the heavy front door. A gust of winter wind swept into the hallway. He stepped out onto the threshold, turned to close the door, and saw Julia standing in the hallway, framed by the warm light of the house. It was a picture of domestic safety. He clicked the latch shut, heard the lock turn from the inside, and walked down the short tiled path to the iron gate. As he walked down Wolverton Street toward the tram stop on Findlay Road, he passed the next-door neighbor, close-up photographer John Johnston, who was returning home. The two men exchanged a brief, polite nod of recognition. Wallace's mind was already shifting focus, calculating the tram routes. He would take the number 4 tram from Belmont Road to Penny Lane, and from there, he would search for the elusive Menlove Gardens West. The city around him was settling into its evening rhythm, oblivious to the tall, thin man embarking on a wild goose chase across the suburbs, and equally oblivious to the silence that had just settled over the house he left behind. Chapter 3: The Wild Goose Chase. The electric hum of the tramcar was a steady, vibrating undercurrent to William Herbert Wallace's thoughts as it rattled through the evening darkness toward Penny Lane. Outside the scratched glass windows, the grand stone villas of Liverpool's merchant class loomed out of the gloom, their sprawling gardens a stark contrast to the cramped brick terraces of Anfield. Wallace sat rigidly on the slatted wooden seat, his long legs folded uncomfortably, checking his silver pocket watch under the dim interior bulbs. It was 7:15. When the tram screeched to a halt at the bustling Penny Lane junction, Wallace stepped off into the biting winter air. He was a man out of his element, but his dedication to duty was unshakable. Somewhere in this labyrinth of affluent avenues was number 25 Menlove Gardens West, and within it, a substantial insurance premium waiting to be collected. He approached a tram conductor standing on the platform, his breath pluming in white clouds. "Excuse me, officer," Wallace said, his tone unfailingly polite. "Could you direct me toward Menlove Gardens West?" The conductor rubbed his gloved hands together, squinting at the thin, stooped figure before him. "Menlove Gardens, sir. You've got north, south, and east just up the road, branching off Menlove Avenue. But I can't say I've ever heard of a west." Wallace felt the first dull throb of frustration behind his eyes. "Are you quite certain? I have an urgent business appointment with a gentleman there at 7:30. "Well, you'll find the others easily enough, sir," the conductor replied, pointing into the darkness. "Follow the avenue up past the church. If there's a west, it'll be amongst them." Thanking the man, Wallace set off at a brisk pace, his leather briefcase swinging at his side. The wind blew harder here, unhindered by the dense rows of houses he was used to. He reached the cluster of streets known as Menlove Gardens. He found Menlove Gardens East, a quiet, respectable crescent of semi-detached houses with neat front lawns. He found Menlove Gardens North, and then Menlove Gardens South. He walked the perimeter of the central triangular gardens, his eyes darting from one street sign to another, illuminated by the pale glare of the gas lamps. There was no Menlove Gardens West. He checked his pocket watch again. It was 25 minutes past 7. The precision that governed his life was slipping away, fractured by an impossible geography. Determined not to miss his client, Wallace began knocking on doors. He stopped at a house in Menlove Gardens East, the door opening to reveal a well-dressed gentleman. "I do beg your pardon," Wallace said, raising his bowler hat slightly. "I am looking for a Mr. R. M. Qualtrough of 25 Menlove Gardens West. Do you happen to know him, or where his residence might be?" The resident shook his head with a polite but dismissive smile. "There is no west here, old man. And I've never heard of a Qualtrough. You must have the wrong district." Refusing to yield to the creeping sense of absurdity, Wallace continued his search. He walked up and down the avenues, his long, dark coat making him look like a spectral figure pacing the affluent suburb. He encountered a police constable, Sergeant Thomas Phillips, walking his beat under the gaslights. To a man of Wallace's law-abiding nature, the uniform was a beacon of absolute certainty. "Constable," Wallace called out, stepping into the light. "I am in a state of some confusion. I am searching for 25 Menlove Gardens West. I have been up and down these streets, but I can only find north, south, and east." Sergeant Phillips halted, looking Wallace up and down. The tall insurance agent looked genuine, his face etched with anxiety and exhaustion. "There is no Menlove Gardens West, sir," the officer said firmly. "I know this beat inside and out. It doesn't exist. Are you sure of the address?" Wallace pulled the scrap of paper from his waistcoat pocket, holding it out with a trembling hand. "This is the message left for me at my club last night. 25 Menlove Gardens West. A Mr. Qualtrough." Phillips inspected the note, then handed it back. "The note might say it, sir, but the city council never built it. There are only 3 sides to the gardens. There is no 4th. But the gentleman was so specific," Wallace murmured, his voice laced with a mixture of bewilderment and growing dread. "He said it was near the allotment gardens. Is there perhaps another street nearby with a similar name?" "You could try Menlove Avenue itself," Phillips suggested, taking pity on the shivering older man. "Or perhaps Green Lane. But as for Menlove Gardens West, you're chasing a ghost. Wallace thanked the officer and walked away, but the word ghost seemed to echo in the cold air. For another 45 minutes, Wallace persisted. He crossed over to Menlove Avenue, checking house numbers, his tall frame casting long, desperate shadows against the stone walls. He spoke to a passerby, a young woman, and even entered a local sweet shop to consult a directory, but every inquiry yielded the same blank look, the same shook head. By 8:45, the reality of the situation finally broke through Wallace's stubborn adherence to routine. There was no Mr. Qualtrough. There was no Menlove Gardens West. The entire affair had been a cruel, elaborate hoax. The realization brought with it a sudden, heavy wave of physical exhaustion. His head throbbed violently, and his frail chest burned from breathing the freezing night air for nearly 2 hours. A fool's errand, he muttered bitterly to himself, adjusting his spectacles as he walked back toward the tram junction. The anger he felt was not just for the lost commission, but for the violation of his time and order. He had been manipulated like a pawn on a chessboard by an unseen player who knew his habits, knew his club, and knew exactly how to lure him to the opposite side of the city. As he boarded the tram for the long journey back to Anfield, the interior warmth offered little comfort. He sat in silence, staring out into the blackness, his mind spinning with unanswered questions. Who would do this? Why take such pains to orchestrate a pointless prank against a harmless, middle-aged insurance clerk? He thought of Julia, waiting for him by the fire in the morning room. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt for leaving her alone for so long on such a bitter night. He comforted himself with the thought that within an hour, he would be back in the safety of 29 Wolverton Street, locking the world outside, and this bizarre evening would become nothing more than a strange story to discuss over a late cup of tea. He had no way of knowing that while he had been wandering the non-existent streets of Mossley Hill, the orderly universe he took for granted had already been irrevocably shattered. Chapter 4. The House of Silence. The clock on the tower of Holy Trinity Church was striking 5 minutes to 9 when William Herbert Wallace finally stepped off the tramcar at Anfield. The journey back from Mossley Hill had felt twice as long as the journey out, his mind churning with a volatile mixture of physical exhaustion and deep resentment. The cold had seeped into his bones, and his throat felt raw from the bitter winter air. He walked down the familiar, dark corridor of Wolverton Street, his eyes instinctively searching for the welcoming amber glow of the front parlor window at number 29. The house was entirely dark. Wallace paused at the iron gate, a slight frown puckering his brow. It was highly unusual for Julia to leave the front unlit when she expected him home, especially given her fragile health and dislike of the dark. He walked up the short, tiled path, reached into his trousers pocket, and drew out his latchkey. He inserted it into the front door lock and turned it. The key rotated smoothly, but the door refused to budge. It was bolted firmly from the inside. Wallace felt a mild prickle of annoyance. Julia must have grown nervous in his absence and secured the house. He knocked sharply on the heavy wood, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet street. He waited, straining his ears for the sound of her soft, shuffling footsteps in the hallway. Nothing. Only the low whistle of the wind between the terraced roofs. He knocked again, louder this time, his knuckles stinging against the cold timber. Julia, he called out, his voice thin and strained. Julia, it is William. Let me in. The silence that returned from within the house was heavy, almost suffocating. A faint tremor of unease stirred in Wallace's chest, though his logical mind quickly suppressed it. She might have fallen asleep by the fire in the morning room, or perhaps her deafness had prevented her from hearing him. He decided to try the back entrance. He walked down the narrow, cobblestone alleyway that ran behind the terrace, a dark lane flanked by high brickyard walls. Finding the wooden gate to number 29, he lifted the latch and stepped into the small, paved yard. He approached the back kitchen door and tried his key there. To his perplexity, this door too was unyielding. He turned the handle and pushed, but it felt locked tight. He knocked vigorously on the kitchen window pane, peering through the glass into the pitch-black interior. Julia, he shouted again, his anxiety now beginning to fray the edges of his usual stoic composure. At that moment, The back door of number 27 opened, and John Johnston, the Wallace's next-door neighbor, stepped out into the yard, accompanied by his wife, Florence. They had heard the persistent knocking and shouting through the thin brick walls. "Is everything all right, Mr. Wallace?" Johnston asked, his figure silhouetted against the light of his kitchen. "I cannot gain admission," Wallace said, turning toward them, his face pale and distorted by the shadows. "The front door is bolted, and the back door seems locked. It is most extraordinary. I am rather putting myself about. Julia doesn't seem to hear me." "That's strange," Mrs. Johnston murmured, stepping forward. "She was in when I spoke to her this afternoon. Try the door again, Mr. Wallace." Wallace turned back to the kitchen door. He placed his hand on the knob, inserted the key once more, and gave a firm twist. This time, to his absolute bewilderment, the latch clicked. The door, which had seemed completely immovable only moments before, now swung open easily into the darkness of the kitchen. "Ah," Wallace said, his voice dropping to a flat, cautious register. "It opens now. Would you like us to come in with you?" Johnston offered, sensing the sudden, chilling shift in the atmosphere. "No, thank you," Wallace replied precisely. "Stay there a moment. I will see if she is upstairs." He stepped across the threshold into the freezing, dark house. He did not strike a match immediately. Instead, he navigated by memory through the pitch-black kitchen and into the narrow middle hallway. The air inside smelled faintly of gas and something else, something metallic and heavy that he could not quite identify. "Julia," he called into the dark. "Are you there?" He entered the morning room. The fire in the grate had burned down to a dull, dying crimson eye, casting just enough light to show that her usual armchair was empty. Wallace pulled a box of matches from his pocket, struck one, and lit the gas jet on the wall. The sudden hiss and flare of yellow light illuminated the room. Nothing seemed out of place. Her sewing basket sat on the table. A book lay open nearby. He walked out of the room and toward the front parlor, the match in his hand flickering wildly as he moved. He pushed the door open, struck another match, and touched it to the mantle of the parlor gas lamp. The light flooded the small room, casting harsh shadows across the piano and the heavy Victorian furniture. Then, his eyes fell upon the floor. Julia lay stretched out in front of the hearth, face down on the patterned rug. She was dressed in her dark winter skirt and her heavy knitted shawl, but the garment was now sodden and blackened with an immense pool of dark, viscous fluid that had spread across the carpet. Her silver hair was matted and ruined, crushed into a horrific, shattered mass at the back of her skull. Wallace froze, the match burning down to his fingertips before he dropped it into the darkness. A terrible, absolute stillness clamped down upon the room. He did not scream. He did not rush to her side. He stood like a statue, his tall frame rigid, staring at the ruin of his wife under the cold glare of the gaslight. After what felt like an eternity, he moved forward, his knees stiff. He knelt beside her in the dark pool, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch her shoulder. The fabric was cold. He took her hand, it was limp and devoid of any human warmth. "Oh, Julia," he whispered, his voice cracking into a dry, hollow sob. He looked up at the room around him. On the sofa, her yellow raincoat lay draped haphazardly, heavily splattered with dark, crimson droplets. The room showed no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no shattered ornaments. It was as if death had descended upon her with absolute, instantaneous violence while she stood entirely unawares. Wallace rose to his feet, his mind fracturing into 1,000 disconnected pieces, yet gripped by a strange, chilling clarity. The hoax, the non-existent street, the phone call at the club. The pieces of the chessboard were shifting, and for the first time in his life, William Herbert Wallace realized he was not the player, but the piece being moved toward a terrifying checkmate. He stumbled back out of the parlor, through the hallway, and burst into the backyard where the Johnstons were still waiting in the freezing night. "Come in," Wallace gasped, his face as white as a sheet, his spectacles reflecting the dim light of their yard. "Come in. She's been killed. Someone has murdered her." Chapter 5. The crime scene. The narrow hallway of 29 Wolverton Street, usually so quiet and orderly, was suddenly filled with the heavy thud of police boots and the frantic, hushed whispers of neighbors. John Johnston had rushed to fetch the nearest medical man, returning within minutes with Dr. Hugh McCurdy, a local practitioner whose face grew grim the moment he stepped across the threshold. Wallace sat in the morning room, his long hands clasped between his knees, staring blankly at the floor. He was a picture of absolute, unnatural stillness amidst the gathering chaos. When Police Constable Thompson arrived, followed shortly by Detective Inspector John Gold and a small cohort of officers, the small house felt suffocatingly small, choked with the smell of damp wool, burning gas, and the unmistakable, copper tang of blood. Inspector Gold, a seasoned officer with a sharp eye and a cynical disposition born of Liverpool's rough docklands, entered the front parlor. He stopped, his gaze locking onto the horrific scene. Julia Wallace lay exactly as her husband had found her, a frail woman utterly destroyed in the sanctuary of her own home. Gold knelt carefully, avoiding the vast, congealed pool of dark crimson. The back of her skull had been subjected to a savage, frenzied battering. Gold counted multiple distinct entry wounds from a blunt instrument, a weapon wielded with enough force to shatter bone and spray blood high across the wallpaper and the lower folds of the armchair. Dr. McCurdy, Gold said, his voice low as the physician examined the body. What do you make of the time of death? McCurdy gently lifted one of Julia's arms, testing the joints, before pressing his palm against her neck. Rigor mortis is already setting in, Inspector. The body is quite cold. Given the temperature of the room and the state of the blood, I would estimate she was killed between 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock this evening. Certainly no later than 8. Gold nodded, his mind immediately calculating the timeline. He left the parlor and walked into the morning room, where Wallace remained seated. The insurance agent looked up, his spectacles reflecting the gaslight, his expression remarkably detached. To Gold, who was used to the hysterical wailing of grieving relatives, Wallace's calm composure was striking, and instantly suspicious. Mr. Wallace, Gold began, pulling out a leather-bound notebook. I know this is an unspeakable shock, but I must ask you some questions. Can you account for your movements this evening? Of course, Inspector, Wallace replied, his voice thin, precise, and entirely devoid of tremor. I left this house at approximately 6:45 to attend a business appointment in Mossley Hill. A gentleman named Qualtrough had left a message for me at the Liverpool Chess Club last night, requesting that I visit him at 25 Menlove Gardens West at 7:30. Gold's pencil scratched against the paper. And did you find this Mr. Qualtrough? I did not, Wallace said, shaking his head slightly. Because, Inspector, the address does not exist. I spent nearly 2 hours wandering the district, speaking to tram conductors, a passerby, and a police constable, Sergeant Phillips, I believe his name was. They all confirmed there is no Menlove Gardens West. I realized I had been made the victim of a pointless hoax, so I took the tram back to Anfield. I arrived at 9:05. Gold listened, his eyes narrowing slightly. It was an incredibly detailed story, almost too rehearsed, complete with the name of a specific police officer who could verify his presence miles away at the presumed time of the murder. A perfect alibi, wrapped up in a bizarre wild goose chase. And when you returned? Gold asked. The front door was bolted from the inside. I tried the back door, and it too seemed locked at first. I was rather putting myself about, so I called out to my neighbors, the Johnstons. When I tried the back kitchen door again, it opened. I entered, lit the gas, and found my wife in the parlor. Gold stood up, walking toward the kitchen to inspect the entry points. The lock on the back door was intact. There were no signs of forced entry on any window or door. The house was secure. If an intruder had entered, they had either been let in by Julia, possessed a key, or, more chillingly, had never left. He examined the kitchen mantelpiece. A small cash box, where Wallace kept his prudential collection money, lay open. Mr. Wallace, Gold called out. Is anything missing from the house? Wallace rose and walked into the kitchen, his movements slow and deliberate. He peered into the cash box. Yes, Inspector. There should be about £4 here in notes and silver from my collections. It appears to have been taken. But curiously, several larger checks and insurance papers have been left untouched. Gold looked at the box, then back at Wallace. A robbery. It was the obvious motive, yet something felt fundamentally wrong. The violence inflicted upon Julia Wallace was not the quick, efficient blow of a panicked thief caught in the act. It was a brutal, sustained execution. It spoke of malice, of deep-seated rage, or of a cold-blooded calculation designed to look like a robbery gone wrong. "We will need to search the house thoroughly, Mr. Wallace," Gold said, his tone hardening. "And I must ask you to accompany us to the station tomorrow to provide a formal, signed statement." "I am entirely at your service, Inspector," Wallace said politely, adjusting his cuffs. As Gold watched the tall, stooped man, a dark suspicion began to take root in his mind. He looked at the yellow raincoat splattered with blood on the parlor sofa, then at Wallace's clean suit. The timeline was tight, the geography impossible, and the husband's lack of tears deeply unnatural. The investigation had barely begun, but in the eyes of Liverpool's finest, the husband was already moving into the center of the frame. Chapter 6: The Anatomy of Alibi. By the dawn of Wednesday the 21st of January 29 Wolverton Street had ceased to be a home and had become an operational theatre for the Liverpool City Police. The morning light filtered through the parlour curtains, casting a cold, grey pallor over the blood-spattered furniture. Detective Superintendent Herbert Moore, a man of methodical intellect and vast administrative experience, arrived early to take personal charge of the investigation. He was accompanied by a fingerprint expert and Professor John Edward Willoughby McFall, a towering authority in forensic medicine from Liverpool University. While the technicians dusted the piano keys and the mantelpiece for prints, Professor McFall knelt beside the body of Julia Wallace. He was a meticulous examiner, assessing the wounds with a clinical, detached rigor. He noted that the heavy woolen shawl wrapped around Julia's neck had been scorched, and her right arm was fractured, a defensive wound, indicating she had raised her arm in a desperate, final attempt to shield herself from the descending blows. Superintendent Moore stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. "What is the verdict, Professor?" McFall stood up, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. His expression was grim. "The severity of the injuries is extreme, Moore. Her skull has been fractured in multiple places by a heavy, blunt weapon, something like an iron bar, a poker, or a heavy spanner. The blow that killed her came from behind, likely while she was sitting or standing quite unawares. But the subsequent blows, that was sheer ferocity. And the time of death?" Moore pressed. McFall frowned, checking his notes. "The onset of rigor mortis is well advanced. Given the cold ambient temperature of this house, I place the time of death squarely between 6 o'clock and 6:30 yesterday evening. Certainly no later than 6:45. Moore's mind immediately focused on the critical window. 6 o'clock to 6:45. According to the preliminary statement taken by Inspector Gold, William Herbert Wallace claimed to have left the house at precisely 25 minutes to 7. If McFall's estimation was correct, the timeline was microscopic. Wallace would have had to murder his wife, clean himself of the massive volume of blood spray, stage the robbery of the insurance cash box, change his clothing, and walk out the door to catch the tram, all within a matter of minutes. "Is it possible," Moore asked, "that she was killed later? Say, 7 o'clock. "Highly unlikely," McFall replied firmly. "The drop in body temperature and the rigidity of the limbs strongly point to the earlier hour. If the husband left at 25 minutes to 7, he was either in the house when she died, or he left her dead on the floor." Armed with this forensic timeline, Moore returned to the Central Police Station on Dale Street, where Wallace was waiting to give his formal statement. The insurance agent sat quietly in an interview room, his bowler hat on the table beside him. He looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot behind his thick spectacles, but his demeanor remained unnervingly precise. Inspector Gold sat opposite him, a stack of blank paper ready. For the next 3 hours, Wallace recounted his movements with mathematical exactness. He detailed the exact time he left the house, the numbers of the tramcars he boarded, the names of the streets he walked, and the exact words spoken by the conductor, the passerby, and Sergeant Phillips in Mossley Hill. You have a remarkable memory for detail, Mr. Wallace, Gold observed, leaning forward. Most men under such duress would struggle to remember which tram they took, let alone the conductor's badge number. I am an insurance agent, Inspector, Wallace replied in his flat, nasal tone. My entire livelihood depends upon the precise notation of times, dates, and figures. If I am inaccurate, my ledgers do not balance. I am merely applying the same standards of exactness to the events of Tuesday evening. And you maintain you have no idea who this Mr. Qualtrough is? Moore asked, stepping into the room. None whatsoever, Wallace said, turning his gaze to the superintendent. I have combed through my memories and my client files. There is no such name. It is quite clear to me now that the telephone call to the chess club was a deliberate ruse to draw me away from my home. A ruse, Moore repeated, studying Wallace's face. A ruse that required the caller to know you would be at the chess club on Monday night. A ruse that required an intimate knowledge of your profession. Tell me, Mr. Wallace, who besides yourself knew you would be at the Central Cafe that evening? The club schedule is posted in advance, Wallace said. Any member could have seen it. And, of course, anyone who knows my habits would know I occasionally play on Mondays. Moore let out a slow breath. The alibi was perfectly constructed, so perfect, in fact, that it felt artificial. To the detectives, it looked like a grandmaster chess move, a sacrificial gambit designed to distract the opponent while the real strike was delivered in the dark. If Wallace had planned the murder, he would need to be seen far away from Anfield at the exact time the crime was committed. What better way to achieve that than by creating a high-profile, easily verifiable trail of encounters across the city, searching for a street that didn't exist? As the interview concluded, Wallace was permitted to leave, though he was pointedly informed that he was not to return to Wolverton Street, which remained a sealed crime scene. He took up temporary lodging with his sister-in-law, entirely aware of the suspicious glances from the offices as he walked out into the Liverpool rain. The police had their timeline, they had their medical opinion, and they had a motive, the missing £4 and the heavy weight of an unhappy, isolated marriage. The net was beginning to cast wide, and its center was fixed entirely on the tall, stooped insurance agent. Chapter 7. The Telephone Track. While William Herbert Wallace adjusted to the cold isolation of his temporary lodgings, Detective Inspector Gold focused his attention on the very origin of the mystery, the telephone call that had set the entire tragedy in motion. On the morning of Thursday the 22nd of January, Gold walked into the bustling exchange of the Liverpool post office, accompanied by a specialist linesman. In 1931, telephone calls were not the anonymous, untraceable data packets of the future. They were physical connections made by human hands plugging brass jacks into vertical switchboards. Every trunk call and public kiosk connection left a paper trail of operator tickets. Gold was determined to find out exactly where R.M. Qualtrough had stood when he dialed the Liverpool Chess Club on Monday evening. The administrative records of the post office were ledgered with a precision that rivaled Wallace's own insurance books. Within hours, the traffic supervisors isolated the specific connection made to the Central Cafe at approximately 20 minutes past 7 on Monday the 19th of January. Here it is, Inspector, the supervisor said, pointing a blunt finger at a stamped ink entry. The call originated from a public telephone kiosk at the corner of Rochester Road and Anfield Road. Gold felt a sudden, sharp prickle of electricity run down his spine. Anfield Road. Are you certain? Absolutely, sir. The operator routed it through the Anfield Exchange. It's a red iron kiosk, just outside the cinema. Gold didn't wait. He took a police vehicle straight back to Anfield, his mind racing. He parked at the intersection of Rochester Road and Anfield Road and stepped out into the damp chill. He stood before the red telephone box, looking around. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The kiosk was located less than 400 yards from 29 Wolverton Street. It was a mere 5-minute walk from Wallace's front door. Gold stepped inside the cramped glass structure, the smell of stale tobacco and cold iron pressing in on him. He looked out through the glass panes. From this very spot, the mysterious caller had picked up the heavy receiver, dropped his pennies into the slot, and spoken to Samuel Beattie at the chess club. If Qualtrough was a wealthy resident from the affluent suburb of Mossley Hill, why on earth was he standing in a public telephone box in working-class Anfield, just a stone's throw from the target's house, to make the call? The answer, to Gould's increasingly cynical mind, was blindingly obvious. There was no Qualtrough. The caller was William Herbert Wallace himself. The timeline fitted perfectly. On Monday evening, Wallace had left his house to go to the chess club. He had simply walked down his own street, stepped into this kiosk at 7:15 p.m., dialed the club to plant the elaborate Qualtrough message with Beattie, and then boarded the tram to the city centre to arrive at the club just after the message had been delivered. It was a masterfully calculated piece of staging, designed to create a fictional persona who would later lure him out to Mossley Hill on the night of the murder. Gould returned to Dale Street immediately to brief Superintendent Moore. The detectives huddled over a large wall map of the Anfield district, a compass drawing a tight circle around Wolverton Street. "It's too close to be a coincidence," Hubert, Gould argued, his voice tight with conviction. Wallace leaves the house on Monday, walks past the cinema, slips into the kiosk, and invents Qualtrough. He gives himself 24 hours to prepare. Then on Tuesday, he kills her before he leaves, and uses the fictional address to create a frantic, highly visible search across Mossley Hill to cement his alibi. Moore tapped his pipe against the edge of the desk, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "It's a compelling theory, John. But we must prove it. Did anyone see him in the kiosk? We need the operator who handled the call." The police quickly tracked down the telephone operator who had connected the call that Monday night, a young woman named Lillian Kelly. She was brought into the station for questioning. "Do you remember the call to the Central Cafe, Miss Kelly?" Moore asked gently. "I do, sir," she replied nervously, twisting her handkerchief. "It was just after 7. The gentleman had a very distinct voice. Very polite, rather deep and nasal. He spoke quite slowly, as if he were choosing his words with great care." "Could you identify that voice if you heard it again?" Gould asked. I think I might, sir. It was very unusual for a public kiosk call. Most working men sound hurried, but this gentleman sounded very educated, like a clerk or a manager." The detectives exchanged a meaningful look. Wallace's voice was notoriously precise, nasal, and pedantic, the voice of a man who spent his life explaining insurance clauses to housewives. Yet, as Moore looked back at the map, a nagging doubt remained. If Wallace was the criminal mastermind they believed him to be, why would he use a telephone kiosk so blindingly close to his own home? Surely a man of his calculated intelligence would have traveled to another part of the city to make the call, avoiding any direct geographical link to Wolverton Street. Was it an act of supreme arrogance, or had the killer simply used the closest available phone, confident that his constructed alibi would hold up against any scrutiny? The telephone track had brought the police straight back to Wallace's doorstep. The web was tightening, but the physical evidence connecting the man to the weapon remained entirely absent. They had the motive, they had the location of the call, and they had a microscopic timeline. Now, they needed to find what Wallace had done with the blood. Chapter 8, The Smoking Garment. While the detectives tracked the digital thread of the telephone call, Professor McFall turned his clinical eye back to the physical evidence collected from the front parlor of 29 Wolverton Street. The most confounding puzzle piece was the yellow Macintosh raincoat that had been found draped over the arm of the sofa, directly behind where Julia Wallace's body had lain. On Friday the 23rd of January, McFall spread the heavy waterproof garment across a large zinc examination table in his university laboratory. Under the brilliant, sterile glare of the electric lights, the Macintosh told a gruesome story. The front and sleeves of the coat were heavily splattered with dark, starburst-shaped patterns of dried blood. McFall leaned close, measuring the diameter of the drops with a brass caliper. This was high-velocity impact spatter, the kind of fine mist generated when a heavy weapon strikes a wet, bleeding surface with tremendous force. But it was the positioning of the blood that caught the professor's attention. The back of the coat was completely clean. Furthermore, When McFall examined the lining of the mackintosh, he discovered a thick smear of clotted blood running along the inside of the collar and down the inner sleeve. Superintendent Moore arrived at the laboratory late in the afternoon, his coat collar turned up against the freezing rain outside. He found McFall staring intently at the yellow garment, a pipe unlit between the professor's teeth. "What has the coat given us, Professor?" Moore asked, stepping up to the table. "It has given us the entire mechanism of the murder, Moore," McFall said, pointing with the tip of his fountain pen. "Look at this spatter. Whoever killed Julia Wallace was standing directly behind or over her, raining blows down upon her skull. The blood sprayed forward, coating the front of this mackintosh. But the coat belongs to William Wallace," Moore noted. "He admits it is his. He claims he left it on the sofa before he departed for Mossley Hill." "If it was on the sofa, Moore, how did the blood get inside the sleeve and the collar?" McFall's voice dropped to a sharp whisper. "A passive garment lying on furniture does not get smeared with thick clots on its internal lining while the exterior back remains pristine. The killer was wearing it." Moore's eyes widened slightly. "Wearing it, but the husband's suit was perfectly clean when he met the neighbors and the police." "Precisely," McFall said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Imagine the scene. It is 20 past 6. Wallace decides to strike. He knows the sheer volume of blood a head wound will produce. He does not want to ruin his good suit or leave incriminating stains that would destroy his alibi. So, he removes his jacket, perhaps all his clothing, and dons this heavy rubber mackintosh backwards, or wears it like a smock." The image formed vividly in Moore's mind, a tall, skeletal man, entirely naked beneath a yellow raincoat, striking his wife down in the flickering gaslight of the parlor. "He delivers the blows," McFall continued, mapping out the theory with theatrical gestures. "The mackintosh shields his body from the spray. Once the deed is done, he strips the coat off, rolling it up to contain the blood. He washes his face and hands at the kitchen sink, which explains why the sink was wet when Thompson examined it, dresses in his clean suit, tosses the blood-stained coat onto the sofa to make it look like part of a chaotic robbery, and walks out the door to catch his tram. It was a brilliantly horrific theory. It solved the great paradox of the case, how a man could commit such an incredibly violent, messy crime and yet appear in public less than an hour later without a single speck of blood on his shirt, collar, or skin. Yet, as Moore processed the professor's deductions, he knew the defense would tear it apart if they didn't find supporting evidence. If Wallace had washed a massive amount of blood down the drains, there should be traces. The police immediately sent technicians back to Wolverton Street with instructions to dismantle the plumbing. They removed the traps beneath the kitchen sink and the bathroom basin, scraping the interior pipes for biological residue. They lifted the floorboards beneath the sink, looking for damp spots or discarded rags. To Moore's intense frustration, the results came back entirely negative. The drains were clean. There was no trace of blood in the U-bends, no crimson staining on the towels, and no signs of a hurried cleanup in the bathroom. If Wallace had stood naked in that house, covered in his wife's blood, he had cleaned himself with a supernatural thoroughness that defied the dark, cramped realities of a Victorian terrace. Furthermore, a forensic chemist from the university threw a wrench into McFall's timeline. Upon analyzing the blood clots on the inside of the coat, the chemist noted that some of the blood appeared to have mixed with human sweat, sweat that matched Julia Wallace's blood type, suggesting she may have been wearing or handling the coat herself before or during the attack. The yellow mackintosh, meant to be the final piece of evidence that would hang William Herbert Wallace, had instead become an enigmatic riddle. It was a smoking gun that pointed in two opposite directions at once, a shield for a cold-blooded killer, or a desperate protective layer used by a dying woman. The pieces of the puzzle were growing more complex, and the clock was ticking toward the day Wallace would have to face his accusers. Chapter 9, The Boy on the Bicycle. As January ground toward its end, the Liverpool City Police found themselves trapped in a frustrating stalemate. Their theory of the crime, that William Herbert Wallace had executed his wife while naked or clad only in a reversed raincoat, was intellectually satisfying to Superintendent Moore, but it lacked the definitive anchor of time. Professor McFall's medical assessment placed the murder firmly between 6 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. Yet, if a single reliable witness had seen Julia Wallace alive after 6:30 p.m., the prosecution's entire case against the husband would collapse into impossibility. On the morning of Tuesday, the 27th of January, Inspector Gold set out to reconstruct the exact timeline of the street on the night of the murder. He began knocking on doors along Wolverton Street and the intersecting avenues, looking for anyone who might have seen a deliveryman, a visitor, or Julia herself. His persistence paid off at a small terrace house on nearby Richmond Park. There, he was directed to a 14-year-old boy named Alan Close. Alan was a bright, sharp-eyed lad who worked evenings delivering milk on a heavy iron bicycle for a local dairy. Gold brought the boy and his father into the Anfield police station. Alan sat on the edge of his chair, his cap clutched in his hands, clearly intimidated by the dark wood and the stern faces of the detectives. "Now, Alan," Gold began gently, leaning forward to offer a reassuring smile. "I want you to think back to last Tuesday evening, the 20th of January. You have a regular milk delivery on Wolverton Street, don't you?" "Yes, sir," the boy replied, his voice cracking slightly. "I deliver to several houses there, including number 29. The Wallaces." Gold felt a familiar prickle of anticipation. "Tell me exactly what happened when you reached number 29 that evening." "Well, sir, I rode my bicycle up the street. It was getting proper dark and cold. I went up the path to the Wallaces' front door and knocked. Mrs. Wallace came to the door herself. I gave her the milk, she paid me the pennies, and I went on my way." Gold's pencil hovered over his notebook. "You are absolutely certain it was Mrs. Julia Wallace?" "Oh, yes, sir. I know her well. She's a very quiet lady, always wears a shawl. She spoke to me just like she always does." This was a critical admission, but it was the next question that would define the trial. "And what time was this, Alan?" "Think very carefully." The boy twisted his cap. "It was 25 minutes past 6, sir." Gold froze. His gaze snapped up to meet Superintendent Moore, who was standing near the window. 25 minutes past 6. If Julia Wallace was alive and speaking to the milk boy at 6:25 p.m., and William Herbert Wallace had left the house to catch his tram at 6:35 p.m., the window for the murder was narrowed to a mere 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, Wallace would have to bring his wife into the parlor, commit an incredibly violent, shattering assault, stage a robbery, clean himself of a catastrophic volume of blood, dress, lock up the house, and walk to the tram stop without showing the slightest sign of haste or agitation to the neighbors he passed. It was possible, but it was dangerously tight. "How can you be so sure of the time, Alan?" Moore stepped forward, his voice dropping to a gravelly, demanding pitch. "A lad on a bicycle doesn't usually look at a watch every minute." "I didn't have a watch, sir," Alan explained quickly, defensive under the superintendent's stare. "But when I left the dairy, I looked at the big clock on the wall. It was 10 past 6. Then, as I rode past the Holy Trinity Church on Townsend Lane, I heard the clock strike the quarter hour, a quarter past 6. Number 29 Wolverton Street was only my second stop after that. It takes me exactly 10 minutes to get from the church to the gate. I checked it against the tram timetables later, sir. It had to be 25 past 6. Moore's face darkened. This boy, with his logical sequence of church bells and delivery routes, had just handed William Herbert Wallace an almost airtight defense. If the defense lawyers got hold of Alan Close, they would use him to demolish Professor McFall's forensic timeline. Over the next 48 hours, the police put Alan Close through a grueling series of re-interviews. They took him back out onto the streets of Anfield with his bicycle, forcing him to recreate the route under the watchful eye of a detective holding a stopwatch. They tested the speed of his pedaling, the time it took to exchange the milk coins, and the distance between the church and the house. Under intense pressure from the older detectives, the boy's confidence began to fracture. "Maybe it was a bit earlier," Alan muttered at one point, staring at the floor. "Maybe it was 5 past 6 when I heard the bells. It was so cold, sir, I might have ridden faster." The police seized on the hesitation. In their official write-ups, the time of the milk delivery began to shift backwards in the ledger, from 6:25 p.m. to 6:20 p.m., and finally, in the prosecution's working theory, to 6:15 p.m. Every minute they could claw back was a minute they could give to Wallace to wield the weapon. Yet, the boy on the bicycle remained a ghost that haunted the prosecution's case. They had managed to muddy the waters of the timeline, but they knew that in the brilliant light of a courtroom, a jury might look at the honest face of a working-class lad and believe his memory over the clinical, constructed theories of university professors and cynical police inspectors. The battle lines were being drawn, and the weapon of choice was the ticking of a clock. Chapter 10. The Arrest. By the first tracking of February 1931, the patience of the Liverpool City Police had entirely evaporated. The investigation had become a matter of public prestige. The newspapers were filled with sensationalized headlines about the Anfield Parlour murder, and the public demanded a resolution. Superintendent Moore and Inspector Gold knew they had pushed their circumstantial case as far as it would go. The timeline was narrow, the forensics were fiercely debated, but the absolute lack of any other viable suspect left them with only one logical destination. On the morning of Monday the 2nd of February, exactly 2 weeks after the mysterious telephone call from Mr. Qualtrough, the paperwork was completed. A warrant for the arrest of William Herbert Wallace on the charge of willful murder was signed by a city magistrate. Inspector Gold, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers, drove through the grey, drizzle-soaked streets to the house of Wallace's sister-in-law, where the insurance agent had been staying. The neighborhood was quiet, though a few curious housewives peeked through their lace curtains at the sight of the police vehicle. When Gold knocked, it was Wallace himself who opened the door. He was dressed in his customary dark suit, though his collar seemed slightly loose around his thin, withered neck. He looked even more gaunt than he had 2 weeks prior, his skin pasty and his eyes deep set behind his heavy spectacles. Yet, his expression remained perfectly flat, an inscrutable mask of quiet compliance. "Good morning, Inspector," Wallace said, his voice dropping into its familiar, precise cadence. "Good morning, Mr. Wallace," Gold replied, his tone heavy and formal. He drew the warrant from his inner pocket. "William Herbert Wallace, I hold a warrant here for your arrest. I am charging you with the murder of your wife, Julia Wallace, at 29 Wolverton Street on the 20th of January. Gold paused, watching for any flicker of guilt, shock, or outrage. There was none. Wallace did not flinch. He did not draw a sharp breath. He simply stood on the threshold, nodding slightly as if being informed of a routine clerical error in his insurance ledgers. "I am further required to caution you," Gold continued, his voice echoing in the small hallway, "that anything you say will be taken down in writing and may be used in evidence." Wallace took a brief moment, adjusting his spectacles with a thin finger. When he spoke, his reply was brief, measured, and entirely clear. "What can I say to a charge of which I am absolutely innocent?" "You must accompany us to the Dale Street station, sir," Gold said, stepping aside to allow Wallace to retrieve his coat and bowler hat. The journey to the Central Police Station was conducted in total, suffocating silence. Wallace sat in the back of the vehicle, staring out at the familiar streets of Liverpool, the very streets he had walked for 16 years, collecting pennies from the working class. Now, those same people watched from the pavements as the tall, stooped figure was driven away in a police car. Upon arriving at Dale Street, Wallace was taken down into the subterranean booking area. He was ordered to empty his pockets. One by one, his meager possessions were placed on the heavy wooden counter: a small penknife, a few silver shillings, a fountain pen, a clean pocket handkerchief, and his silver pocket watch, the timepiece that had governed his meticulous movements on the night of the crime. He was then led down a dim, whitewashed corridor smelling of carbolic soap and damp stone, into a small cell. The heavy iron door slammed shut with a resounding, metallic crash that echoed through the cell block. The bolt slid into place with an absolute, terrifying finality. Wallace sat down on the narrow wooden bench, his long legs folded awkwardly. For the first time, he was completely cut off from his books, his chess pieces, and the quiet routine that had protected him from the chaos of the world. He was now a prisoner, stripped of his respectability, facing the ultimate weight of the British Empire's legal machinery. That evening, Superintendent Moore visited the cell. He stood by the iron-barred window, looking down at the prisoner. "The grand jury will hear the indictment within the month, Wallace. Your defense will need to be ready." Wallace looked up, his face cast in deep shadow. "My defense is the truth, Superintendent. I was miles away, searching for a man who lied to me. If your department spent more time looking for the person who actually made that phone call, instead of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole with me, you would have your killer." Moore did not reply. He walked out, leaving Wallace alone in the gathering darkness. The chess match was over, the opening gambits had been played, the pieces deployed. The crown had made its move, trapping the king. Now, the battle would shift from the dark rooms of Anfield to the brilliant, unforgiving stage of the courtroom, where 12 ordinary citizens would decide whether the thin insurance agent was a grieving widower or a monstrously calculating killer. Chapter 11. The brief for the defense. The news of William Herbert Wallace's arrest sent a shockwave through the Liverpool insurance offices and the quiet chess rooms of the city. While the public prejudged him as a cold-blooded monster who had masqueraded behind an insurance ledger, a few influential figures felt a deep, unsettling doubt. Among them were the leadership of the Prudential Assurance Company, who knew Wallace as a harmless, fastidious servant, and the members of the Liverpool Chess Club, who could not reconcile the gentle, analytical player with a brutal slayer of an elderly woman. Recognizing that Wallace lacked the financial means to mount a formidable defense against the infinite resources of the Crown, a legal defense fund was quickly established. To lead his legal team, they secured the services of Mr. Sidney Schofield Allen, a brilliant, sharp-tongued Liverpool barrister, and Mr. Hector Munro, a highly respected local solicitor known for his meticulous preparation. On a freezing afternoon in mid-February, Munro and Schofield Allen sat opposite Wallace in the stark, whitewashed visitors' room at Wolverton Jail. A single high window cast a pale beam of light across the wooden table. "Mr. Wallace," Schofield Allen began, laying out a thick bundle of legal papers. "We have received the depositions from the police court hearings. The prosecution's case against you is entirely circumstantial, but it is built like a steel trap. They are going to argue that you had a microscopic window of time, perhaps less than 10 minutes, to kill your wife, clean yourself completely, and leave the house." Wallace nodded slowly, his fingers interlaced. "It is an absurdity, Mr. Allen. I loved Julia. We had our quiet ways, but there was never a crossword between us. Why would I destroy the only person who shared my life? Motive is where they are weakest," Munro added, leaning forward. "They will try to suggest financial gain from the missing £4, or an underlying domestic unhappiness. But we can counter that with testimony from your neighbors and colleagues who saw nothing but affection between you. No, the real battle will not be fought over why it was done. It will be fought over the clock." Schofield Allen pulled out a large diagram of the Anfield district. "The Crown's medical expert, Professor McFall, is pinning the time of death between 6 o'clock and 6:30. He claims the onset of rigor mortis proves this. If the jury accepts his timeline, you are in grave danger, because you did not leave the house until 25 minutes to 7. But what about the milk boy?" Wallace asked, his voice rising slightly with a rare flash of animation. "Alan Close. He saw Julia alive at 25 minutes past 6. He told the police so." "The police have already begun to squeeze the boy," Munro warned grimly. "In the latest depositions, they have managed to make him hesitate. They are going to argue at trial that his delivery was actually closer to 15 minutes past 6, giving you an extra 10 minutes to commit the deed. We must ensure Alan Close stands firm on the witness stand." Schofield Allen tapped his fountain pen against the table. "Even if Close stands firm at 6:25, the Crown will argue that 10 minutes is all a calculated mind like yours required. They have a horrifying theory, William. They believe you stripped naked, wore your yellow Macintosh raincoat backwards to shield yourself from the blood spray, executed her, washed at the kitchen sink, dressed in your clean suit, and walked out." Wallace stared at the barrister, his pale face turning a sickly shade of grey behind his thick spectacles. For a long moment, the room was entirely silent, save for the distant, heavy clanging of a prison gate. "Naked," Wallace whispered, his voice trembling with genuine revulsion. "They believe I, a Christian man, a servant of the public, would stand naked and slaughter my own wife. It is a monstrous, disgusting fabrication. There was no blood on me. There was no blood in the drains. How can they present such a fantasy as evidence in a court of law? Because they have no other way to explain how a man could commit such an assault and look like a saint on a tramcar 20 minutes later," Schofield Allen said quietly. "We must attack McFall's medical certainty. Rigor mortis is a notoriously unreliable indicator of time, heavily influenced by temperature, emotion, and physical health. Julia was a frail, bronchial woman. Her body would cool much faster than a healthy man's." Munro nodded in agreement. "I am already consulting independent pathologists in London. If we can prove Julia could have died after you left the house, say, between 6:45 and 7 o'clock, then your presence on those trams in Mossley Hill becomes your salvation, not your execution." As the consultation drew to a close, Schofield Allen looked intently into the eyes of the accused man. He saw no panic, no sweat, no shifting gaze. He saw only the exhausted, pedantic compliance of an aging clerk who believed that if he simply explained his ledger clearly enough, the mistake would be rectified. "It will be a spectacular trial, William," the barrister said, gathering his papers. "The Crown will be led by Mr. Edward George Herbert, the Recorder of Liverpool. He is a formidable prosecutor, highly theatrical, and he will show you no mercy. You must be prepared to maintain your composure under a cross-examination that will try to tear your character to shreds." "I have nothing to fear from the truth, sir," Wallace replied, standing up as the prison guard stepped into the room. "I only ask that the jury looks at the facts, and not the fairy tales the police have invented to cover their own failures." Back in his cold cell that night, Wallace lay awake, listening to the heavy rain lashing against the stone walls of Wolverton Jail. The legal defense was prepared, the strategy mapped out like a defensive opening in a chess tournament. But as he closed his eyes, the image of the yellow Macintosh on the sofa flashed before him, a garment transformed by the police into a shroud of absolute evil, and the peace around which his very life would now turn. Chapter 12, The Court of King's Bench. The morning of Wednesday the 22nd of April 1931, arrived with a rare burst of spring sunshine that illuminated the massive stone columns of Liverpool's St. George's Hall. Despite the fine weather, a heavy, somber atmosphere hung over the city. Long before the iron gates opened, a sprawling crowd of thousands choked the plateau outside, desperate to catch a glimpse of the prisoner or secure a coveted seat in the public gallery. The Anfield Parlour murder had captured the nation's imagination, and today, the final act was set to begin. Inside court number 2, the air was thick, smelling of old leather, floor polish, and packed human bodies. The courtroom was a masterclass in Victorian legal theatre, with high mahogany paneling, an elevated judicial bench, and a stark, central dock. William Herbert Wallace was led up the narrow wooden stairs into the dock. He looked frail, his charcoal grey suit hanging loosely on his gaunt frame, but his head was held erect. He adjusted his heavy spectacles and looked calmly across the room. He showed no reaction to the hundreds of eyes locking onto him, nor to the low, electric murmur that swept through the gallery at his appearance. To Wallace, this was simply another ledger that needed to be audited, though his own life was the balance. A sharp rap of the tipstaff staff silenced the room. Silence. All persons having anything to do before my lords the King's Justices. Mr. Justice Wright, a distinguished and remarkably fair-minded jurist, entered in his scarlet robes and full-bottomed wig, taking his seat beneath the royal coat of arms. The jury, 12 ordinary men of Lancashire, mostly shopkeepers and clerks, were sworn in, their faces tight with gravity. The battle lines were instantly drawn by the arrival of the opposing counsel. Leading the prosecution was Mr. Edward George Herbert, K.C., the Recorder of Liverpool. Herbert was a towering figure in the legal world, possessing a rich, theatrical voice and a reputation for aggressive, unyielding cross-examinations. Opposite him sat Mr. Sidney Schofield Allen, the sharp, analytical defender who had vowed to dismantle the Crown's circumstantial framework piece by piece. Hemed rose to deliver the opening statement for the Crown. He adjusted his silk gown, leaned forward against the wooden rail, and fixed the jury with an intense, unwavering gaze. "May it please your lordship, gentlemen of the jury," Hemed began, his voice booming through the rafters of the historic hall. "On the night of Tuesday, the 20th of January, a crime of unparalleled ferocity was committed in a quiet, respectable street in this city. Julia Wallace, an elderly, frail, and completely defenseless woman, was brutally struck down in her own parlor, her skull shattered by a succession of merciless blows." He paused, letting the horror of the imagery settle over the jury box. He turned slightly, pointing a long, dramatic finger toward the dock. "The Crown will show you that this was not the work of a panicked burglar or a wandering madman. No, gentlemen, this was a crime of cold, calculated, and devilish ingenuity. It was a crime planned with the precision of a chess master, executed with chilling efficiency, and covered up by an alibi so perfect, so heavily rehearsed, that it bears the unmistakable hallmark of its creator." Hemed then laid out the prosecution's narrative with masterful narrative skill. He described the mysterious telephone call to the Central Cafe on Monday night, tracing it straight to the public kiosk just 400 yards from Wallace's home. "The voice that invented Mr. Qualtrough was the voice of the prisoner," Hemed declared. "He created a phantom. He created a non-existent street, Menlove Gardens West, for the sole purpose of sending himself on a highly visible, frantic search through the suburbs of Mossley Hill on Tuesday night. He ensured that tram conductors, passengers, and even a police officer would remember him, thereby placing himself miles away from the scene of the crime. But," Hemed's voice dropped to a theatrical whisper, "the prisoner made a fatal miscalculation. He calculated his time too closely. The Crown will produce medical evidence from the finest authorities in the land to prove that Julia Wallace was murdered before the prisoner ever left his house. He wielded the weapon, gentlemen. He wore his own rubber Macintosh raincoat to shield himself from the torrent of blood, stripped it off, threw it onto the sofa, dressed in his clean clothes, and walked out to catch his tram with the blood of his wife virtually still warm on the floor behind him." A collective gasp rippled through the public gallery. In the dock, Wallace remained perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask. Only a slight hardening of his jaw betrayed the utter revulsion he felt at Hemed's vivid, naked theory. Schofield Allen sat with his arms folded, his face expressionless, making quick, sharp notes on his brief. He knew the emotional weight of Hemed's opening was immense, but he also knew that emotional theater was not evidence. The Crown had promised a magnificent structure, but its entire foundation rested upon a single, volatile pillar, the ticking of the clock. If he could break their timeline, the grand house of cards Hemed was building would come crashing down. "Call Police Constable Thompson," Hemed commanded, sitting down as the first witness stepped toward the box. The trial of the century had truly begun, and the machinery of the law was grinding into motion, preparing to crush the thin insurance clerk beneath its wheels. Chapter 13. The Medical Expert. The technical heart of the prosecution's case arrived on the second afternoon of the trial, when Edward George Hemed called Professor John Edward Willoughby McFall to the witness box. The courtroom fell into a hushed, expectant silence. McFall was a towering figure in forensic medicine, and his testimony was the steel pillar upon which the Crown's entire timeline rested. Adjusting his spectacles, McFall glanced across at William Herbert Wallace in the dock before turning his attention to the jury. With clinical detachment, he described the condition of Julia Wallace's body as he had found it on that cold January night. "I examined the deceased at 5 minutes past 11 o'clock, McFall stated, his voice ringing with academic authority. Rigor mortis was already well advanced in the left upper extremity and the neck. The body was cold, and the temperature of the room was notably low." Hemed leaned forward against the prosecution desk. "Based on these observations, Professor, what was your definitive conclusion regarding the time of death?" "I formed the opinion, which I hold firmly, that she had been dead not less than 4 hours, and probably closer to 6, McFall replied, gesturing toward his notes. "I place the time of her death squarely between 6 o'clock and 6:30 on Tuesday evening. I am confident she could not have been alive past 6:45. A visible stir went through the courtroom. If McFall was correct, the timeline caught Wallace in an inescapable trap. Since Wallace claimed to have left the house at 25 minutes to 7, the forensic evidence placed him in the parlor at the exact moment his wife's skull was shattered. And what of the weapon, Professor? Herbert asked. An instrument of considerable weight, McFall said, his tone grim. A heavy iron bar, a large spanner, or a fireplace poker. The force used was immense. The first blow, delivered from behind, fractured the skull and caused instantaneous unconsciousness. The subsequent 11 blows were an exhibition of absolute frenzy. Herbert then shifted to the most sensational element of the Crown's theory, the yellow Macintosh. You examined the blood-stained raincoat found on the sofa. How do you account for the blood found inside * the lining of the sleeve and collar, while the exterior back remained entirely clean? There is only one logical explanation, McFall declared, looking directly at the jury. The garment was not lying passively on the furniture when the blood sprayed. It was being worn. The killer wore that Macintosh to protect his clothing from the catastrophic volume of blood spatter. Once the assault was complete, he stripped it off, leaving the internal blood smears as he did so, and tossed it aside. Herbert smiled faintly and sat down. The prosecution's trap had been sprung with clinical precision. Sidney Schofield Allen rose for the cross-examination. He adjusted his silk gown, his demeanor sharp, cool, and combative. He knew that if he could not shake McFall's medical certainty, his client would hang. Professor McFall, Schofield Allen began, his voice laced with a polite but lethal skepticism. You have stated with absolute confidence that death occurred between 6 and 6:30. Is it not a recognized fact in forensic science that rigor mortis is one of the most volatile and unreliable indicators of the time of death? McFall shifted his weight, his academic pride visibly pricked. It is subject to variations, certainly. But when combined with the cooling of the body, a skilled observer can form a highly accurate estimate. Variations, indeed, Schofield Allen pounced. Is it not true that a sudden, violent death, such as a brutal assault, can cause the instantaneous onset of rigor mortis, known as a cadaveric spasm? It is possible in some cases, yes, McFall admitted reluctantly. And is it not also true that the room was bitterly cold, and that the deceased was a frail, elderly woman suffering from chronic bronchitis? Schofield Allen pressed, stepping closer to the box. Would not her thin frame and poor health cause her body temperature to drop far more rapidly than that of a healthy man, thereby accelerating the onset of rigidity? It would have an effect, McFall conceded, his voice losing a fraction of its certainty. But not to the extent of shifting the timeline by hours. I am not asking for hours, Professor, Schofield Allen counted sharply. I am asking for 15 minutes. If Julia Wallace was killed at 6:45, or 10 minutes to 7, your entire medical trap evaporates, does it not? My estimate remains 6 to 6:30, McFall insisted stubbornly. Schofield Allen turned his attention to the raincoat. Let us look at your naked killer theory, Professor. You suggest the killer removed his clothing, donned this heavy Macintosh, committed a blood-soaked murder, and then cleaned himself. If a man had washed a massive quantity of blood from his skin and hair, would there not be biological traces left behind? One would expect so, McFall said. Yet the police pulled apart the plumbing at 29 Wolverton Street, Schofield Allen shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. They scraped the U-bends. They lifted the floorboards. They found absolutely nothing. No blood in the drains, no blood on the towels, no blood on the carpets. Are you asking this jury to believe that an aging insurance clerk possessed the supernatural ability to scrub a house and his own skin completely free of forensic evidence in a matter of 5 minutes? McFall hesitated, glancing toward Herbert before looking back at the defense counsel. I am merely stating what the blood on the Macintosh tells us. The mechanics of how he cleaned himself are a matter for the police. Thank you, Professor, Schofield Allen said quietly, sitting down. That will be all. A low murmur broke out across the gallery. The defense had not destroyed McFall, but they had cracked his armor of absolute certainty. The jury was left to ponder a terrifying paradox: a murder of unparalleled, messy ferocity, and a suspect who had stepped onto a public tramcar less than an hour later, immaculately clean, smelling of nothing but the winter air. Chapter 14. The defense strikes back. The defense opened its case on the third morning of the trial, with Sidney Schofield Allen fully aware that emotional pleas would not save William Herbert Wallace. To secure an acquittal, he had to physically break the prosecution's clock. He needed the jury to see that the Crown's timeline was not a masterfully constructed trap, but an impossible fiction. "Call Allen close," Schofield Allen announced, his voice clear and resonant. The 14-year-old milk delivery boy walked into the witness box, looking even smaller and more vulnerable than he had in the police station. He was dressed in his Sunday best, his hair neatly combed, but his hands shook as he took the Bible. For the defense, this working-class lad was the ultimate weapon. Schofield Allen approached the box with a gentle, reassuring smile. "Now, Allen, I want you to tell my lord and the gentlemen of the jury about your evening delivery to 29 Wolverton Street on Tuesday, the 20th of January. "Yes, sir," Allen said, clearing his throat. "I rode my bicycle up the street to deliver the milk. I knocked on the door, and Mrs. Wallace came out to meet me. She took the milk and paid me." "And you knew Mrs. Wallace well?" "Oh, yes, sir. I saw her almost every evening." "Allen," Schofield Allen said, his tone dropping to a deliberate, measured pitch. "What time did you hand that milk to Mrs. Wallace?" "It was 25 minutes past 6, sir," the boy said firmly. "Are you absolutely certain of that time?" "Yes, sir. I heard the Holy Trinity Church clock strike 6:15 when I was on Townsend Lane. It takes me exactly 10 minutes to ride to the gate. It couldn't have been any other time." Schofield Allen turned toward the jury box, ensuring every single one of them was looking at the boy. "Thank you, Allen. Julia Wallace was alive, well, and speaking to her milk boy at 25 minutes past 6. Edward George Hemmard rose for the cross-examination like a predator stalking its prey. He adjusted his silk gown, stepped into the center of the well, and fixed the boy with a terrifying, piercing gaze. "Now, Allen," Hemmard began, his rich voice dripping with patronizing skepticism. "You are a very bright lad, but you didn't actually look at a watch when you stood at that door, did you?" "No, sir," Allen muttered, his confidence beginning to waver under the intense pressure. "And you told the police detectives during your interviews that it might have been earlier, did you not? You told them it might have been 20 past 6, or even 6:15. They kept asking me over and over, sir," Allen said, his eyes welling with tears. "They told me I must have ridden faster because of the cold. They made me feel like I'd done something wrong." "I am not saying you did anything wrong, my boy," Hemmard purred, leaning forward. "I am simply suggesting that on a freezing, dark winter night, a lad on a bicycle might easily miscalculate 5 or 10 minutes. If you left the dairy slightly earlier, or if the church bells rang at a different point in your journey, it could easily have been 20 past 6 when you saw Mrs. Wallace, couldn't it?" I suppose it could have been, sir," Allen whispered, burying his face in his hands. Hemmard sat down, a look of triumph on his face. He had introduced just enough doubt into the boy's testimony to keep the prosecution's narrow window of opportunity alive. If the delivery was at 6:20 p.m., Wallace had 15 minutes. To counteract the damage, Schofield Allen immediately called a succession of local residents and tram conductors. One after another, they took the stand, establishing an unshakable trail of documentation for Wallace's journey to Mossley Hill. Arthur Smith, the conductor of the tramcar that Wallace boarded at Smithdown Road, verified that Wallace had checked the time with him specifically. "He asked me if the tram went to Menlove Gardens," Smith testified. "He seemed very anxious about the time, stating he had an appointment at 7:30. I checked my own watch. It was exactly 10 minutes past 7. "Did he appear agitated, or hurried?" Schofield Allen asked. "Not at all, sir. He was perfectly calm, exceptionally polite. Just an ordinary elderly gentleman out on business." The defense then called Dr. Robert John McLean, a distinguished independent pathologist from London, to directly challenge Professor McFall's medical absolute. Rigor mortis is a wholly erratic phenomenon, Dr. McLean stated authoritatively, dismissing McFall's assertions with a wave of his hand. To state with absolute certainty that a person died within a specific 30-minute window based solely on rigidity, especially in an unheated room in January, is medically untenable. In my professional opinion, Julia Wallace could easily have been alive at 25 minutes to 7, or even 7 o'clock. And if she died at 7 o'clock, Dr. McLean, Schofield Allen asked, then the prisoner could not possibly have killed her, McLean replied firmly, as he was verified to be on a tramcar miles away at that exact moment. By the conclusion of the day's proceedings, the absolute certainty of the prosecution's case had been thoroughly fractured. The trial had transformed into a relentless war of minutes and seconds. The jury was left to weigh the terrified, shifting memory of a delivery boy against the clinical dogmatism of a university professor, knowing that within those missing 10 minutes lay either the guilt of a monstrous assassin or the innocence of a ruined man. Chapter 15. The Man in the Dock. The atmosphere in court number 2 reached a fever pitch on the fourth morning of the trial. The public gallery was packed to capacity, with people standing in the aisles to witness the moment every spectator had been waiting for. William Herbert Wallace was about to do what many defendants in capital cases feared most. He was going to step out of the relative safety of the dock and take the witness stand to testify in his own defense. I call the prisoner, William Herbert Wallace, Sidney Schofield Allen announced. A heavy, electric silence fell over the room as Wallace rose. He walked slowly but deliberately across the well of the court, his long, thin frame slightly stooped. He took his place in the witness box, adjusted his heavy spectacles, and calmly raised the Bible in his right hand. His voice, when he took the oath, was thin, flat, and remarkably steady. For the next 2 hours, Schofield Allen guided his client through the narrative of his life and the events of that fateful January week. Wallace spoke with the pedantic precision of an accountant. He described his 16 years of loyal service to the Prudential, his deep affection for his wife, and the quiet, harmonious domestic life at 29 Wolverton Street. Did you have any financial anxieties, Mr. Wallace? Schofield Allen asked. None whatsoever, sir, Wallace replied, his expression detached. We lived comfortably within our means. My position was secure, and Julia had a small inheritance of her own. The suggestion that I would destroy my companion of 16 years for the sake of £4 from an insurance cash box is entirely ludicrous. And what of the telephone call from Mr. Qualtrough? I had never heard the name before, Wallace stated firmly. I fully believed it to be a genuine business inquiry. I went to Mossley Hill in complete good faith, and I was deeply frustrated when the address turned out to be a phantom. I only wished to secure a substantial endowment policy to provide further comfort for my wife. Schofield Allen nodded, satisfied, and sat down. He had presented the jury with a picture of a harmless, predictable clerk, a man entirely incapable of the monstrous violence inflicted upon Julia Wallace. Then, Edward George Hemmard rose for the cross-examination. The recorder of Liverpool did not rush. He adjusted his heavy wig, smoothed the front of his silk gown, and stepped toward the witness box like a grandmaster approaching a chessboard. When he spoke, his rich, theatrical voice boomed through the high rafters of St. George's Hall. Mr. Wallace, Hemmard began, his tone dripping with cold sarcasm. You are a man of exceptional intellect, are you not? A keen student of science, a practiced chess player, a man who prides himself on absolute mathematical precision. I am an insurance agent, sir, Wallace replied flatly. Precision is my duty. Indeed. And it is that very precision that I find so remarkable, Hemmard said, leaning forward against the wooden rail. Let us look at your journey to Mossley Hill on Tuesday night. You spoke to tram conductor Arthur Smith. You checked your watch with him. You spoke to a passerby, a young woman. You spoke to a police officer. You made quite sure, did you not, that every single person you encountered that night would remember the tall, thin insurance clerk who was looking for an address that did not exist? I was lost, sir, Wallace said, his eyes narrowing slightly behind his spectacles. It is entirely natural for a man who is lost in an unfamiliar suburb to seek directions from those who might know the layout of the streets. A man who is lost might ask once or twice, "Mr. Wallace?" Herbert counted sharply, his voice rising. "But you went out of your way to create a spectacular, unforgettable trail of breadcrumbs across Liverpool. You were performing, sir. You knew your wife lay dead and bloody on the parlor floor, and you needed a chorus of witnesses to swear you were miles away." "That is a monstrous lie," Wallace said. His voice did not crack, nor did he shout. He spoke with a chilling, hollow calm that unsettled some members of the jury. "I did not know she was dead. I left her alive and well at 25 minutes to 7. Herbert switched his attack to the physical reality of the crime scene. "Let us talk about your yellow Macintosh raincoat, Mr. Wallace. You admit it belongs to you. You admit it was found draped over the sofa, heavily splattered with your wife's blood. And yet, when the police examined you, your suit was immaculately clean. Not a speck of crimson on your collar, your cuffs, or your skin." "Because I was nowhere near the room when the assault occurred," Wallace said. "Or because you were entirely naked beneath that raincoat," Herbert roared, pointing a dramatic finger at the prisoner. "You stripped away your clothes to avoid incriminating stains. You wore that rubber coat like an executioner's smock. You stood over that poor, frail woman and rained 11 brutal blows upon her skull, safe in the knowledge that you could wash your hands at the sink, dress in your pristine suit, and walk out the door to catch your tram." For the first time in the trial, a flicker of genuine emotion broke through Wallace's stoic mask. His pale face flushed a dark, angry crimson, and his thin lips trembled. "That is a disgusting, filthy invention," Wallace hissed, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the witness box. "I am a Christian man. I loved my wife. To suggest that I would stand naked in my own home and slaughter her, it is a product of your own morbid imagination, sir. There was no blood on me because I am innocent. If you are so innocent, why was the back door locked when you first tried it, yet opened smoothly the moment your neighbors appeared?" Herbert pressed relentlessly. "Did the ghost of Mr. Qualtrough lock it from the inside and fly away through the chimney?" "I cannot explain the lock, sir," Wallace muttered, his anger subsiding back into a heavy, exhausted defeat. "I only know what occurred. The key did not turn the first time. It did the second. I cannot account for mechanical anomalies." Herbert stared at Wallace for a long, agonizing moment, letting the weight of his accusations hang in the stifling air of the courtroom. "I have no further questions for this witness," the prosecutor said quietly, sitting down. Wallace stood in the box for a few seconds more, looking drained and hollow under the cold glare of the electric lights. He had defended himself with logic and precision, but as he walked back to the dock under the suspicious, horrified glares of the public gallery, he knew that his lack of tears had cost him dearly. In the eyes of ordinary men, he had looked less like a grieving husband and more like a cold, calculating machine that had simply calculated its moves too well. Chapter 16. The Scale of Justice. The trial of William Herbert Wallace entered its final, agonizing phase on the fifth morning. The initial sensation and theatrical roars of the courtroom had given way to a heavy, exhausted tension. The jurors sat in their box, their faces pale and lined with fatigue, fully aware that the life of the tall, stooped man in the dock rested entirely in their hands. Sidney Schofield Allen rose to deliver the closing speech for the defense. He did not possess Herbert's booming, theatrical voice, but he had something far more potent for a logical mind, an unshakable adherence to the burden of proof. "Gentlemen of the jury," Schofield Allen began, leaning forward and speaking in a low, earnest cadence. "The Crown has spun a magnificent, terrifying spider's web before your eyes this week. They have given you a story of naked killers, reversed raincoats, and chess-like calculations. But I ask you to look past the theatricality. I ask you to look for the evidence." He struck the wooden rail with his palm. "Where is the weapon? The police have searched every chimney, every drain, and every brick of Anfield. They found nothing. Where is the blood? They stripped the plumbing from Mr. Wallace's home, searching for a single microscopic trace of a cleanup. They found nothing. The prosecution asks you to believe that an ordinary, frail insurance agent achieved a forensic miracle in less than 10 minutes, slaughtering his wife, scrubbing a house clean, and stepping onto a tramcar looking like an immaculate gentleman. Schofield Allen pointed toward the dock. You cannot hang a man on a, maybe, gentleman. You cannot convict on suspicion. If there is a single crack in the prosecution's clock, and the brave testimony of young Alan Close has shattered that clock, then you must give the benefit of that doubt to the prisoner. I demand nothing less than a full acquittal. When Edward George Hemed rose to deliver the final speech for the Crown, the atmosphere shifted instantly back to a dark, menacing reality. He adjusted his silk gown, his gaze locking onto the jury like an inquisitor. My learned friend talks of miracles, gentlemen, Hemed said, his voice rich and dripping with scorn. But the only miracle here is the prisoner's alibi. It is too perfect. It is a monument to human calculation. Who else but a man planning a horrific crime would ensure that every single tram conductor, passenger, and police constable across Liverpool could swear to his exact location, his exact words, and his exact watch checking? Hemed leaned close to the jury box, his eyes burning with conviction. Do not be fooled by the prisoner's mask of cold, unblinking calm. Some men feel no remorse. Some men can look upon the shattered skull of their companion of 16 years and see only a problem in logic to be solved. The telephone kiosk was 400 yards from his door. The timeline fits. The rubber Macintosh tells the gruesome story of its wearer. William Herbert Wallace is the only person who had the opportunity, the access, and the calculated intellect to commit this crime. Justice demands that he pay the price. With the speeches concluded, the courtroom turned its attention to the judicial bench. Mr. Justice Wright adjusted his scarlet robes and began his summing up to the jury. To the surprise of everyone in the gallery, and the visible discomfort of the prosecution team, the judge's address was a devastating critique of the Crown's case. Wright spoke with the calm, majestic neutrality of the British high judiciary. He painstakingly dismantled the circumstantial pillars Hemed had spent days erecting. Gentlemen of the jury, Justice Wright said, his voice echoing clearly through the high hall. You must remember that the prisoner does not have to prove his innocence. It is the Crown that must prove his guilt, and they must do so beyond all reasonable doubt. You have heard a great deal of theory this week. You have heard a theory about a raincoat, a theory about a naked man, a theory about a locked door. The judge paused, looking over his spectacles at the 12 men. But theory is not testimony. Suspicion is not proof. You must look very carefully at the timeline. If you believe the milk delivery boy, Alan Close, and there has been no evidence presented to suggest he is anything but a truthful witness, then the time available to the prisoner to commit this terrible deed was reduced to a matter of mere minutes. You must ask yourselves, is it physically possible for a human being to execute such violence, conceal all traces of blood from his person and the drainage system, dress, and walk to a tram stop in such a window of time without showing a single sign of breathlessness or disarray? Wright leaned back, his expression grave. If the evidence leaves you with a feeling of dissatisfaction, if it leaves you with a lingering doubt, then it is your bounden duty under the law of England to find the prisoner not guilty. You may now retire to consider your verdict. The jury rose and filed out of the courtroom at 20 minutes past 3 in the afternoon. In the dock, Wallace was led down the stairs into the holding cells below. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur of speculation. To the lawyers and journalists gathered at the press table, the judge's summing up felt like a direct order to acquit. The defense team looked relaxed, sharing quiet smiles, confident that the nightmare was finally coming to an end. But in the dark heart of St. George's Hall, the 12 ordinary men of the jury were about to prove that human emotion can defy the most logical of legal directions. Chapter 17, The Cry of the Gallery. The hands on the large mahogany clock in court number 2 crawled with agonizing slowness. 1 hour passed, then another, the stifling air of St. George's Hall growing heavier with every tick. In the well of the court, the barristers had removed their wigs, their initial confidence giving way to a restless, pacing anxiety. Sidney Schofield Allen sat with his chin in his hand, his eyes fixed on the door to the jury room. Why were they taking so long? Mr. Justice Wright's summing up had been a virtual directive to acquit. To a legal mind, there was nothing to debate. At precisely 20 minutes to 6, the sharp, electrifying rap of the tipstaff's staff shattered the murmuring silence. "The jury is returning, my lord." The courtroom transformed instantly into a stadium of absolute stillness. The public gallery packed tighter, hundreds of faces leaning over the wooden balustrades. William Herbert Wallace was led back up the narrow stairs into the dock. He looked terribly frail, his skin almost translucent under the electric lights, but he stood erect, his long hands gripping the brass rail. He adjusted his spectacles and looked toward the jury box. The 12 men filed in. They did not look at the prisoner, the age-old, terrifying omen of a guilty verdict. Their faces were grim, their eyes fixed stubbornly on the floor or the walls. The clerk of the court rose, his voice ringing out in the dead silence. "Gentlemen of the jury, have you agreed upon your verdict?" "We have," the foreman replied, his voice strained and tight. "Do you find the prisoner at the bar, William Herbert Wallace, guilty or not guilty of the willful murder of Julia Wallace?" The foreman took a shallow breath, gripping the edge of the box. "Guilty." For a fraction of a second, the courtroom was totally silent, the word hanging in the air like an impossibility. Then, a collective, sharp intake of breath roared through the gallery, followed instantly by an unprecedented wave of shouting, gasps, and crying. The public, who had devoured every sensationalized headline for months, had expected a conviction, yet the sheer coldness of the word shook the room. In the dock, Wallace did not move. He did not cry out. He did not sink to his knees. A slight, almost imperceptible twitch passed through his right cheek, and his hand tightened on the rail until his knuckles turned a bloodless white. His face remained what it had always been, a mask of quiet, fastidious compliance. He looked like an auditor who had just been told his accounts were £1 million short through a clerical error, astounded, but entirely polite. Mr. Justice Wright sat in absolute, frozen silence. His expression was one of profound, visible shock. He stared at the jury box for several long seconds, as if waiting for the foreman to correct a catastrophic mistake. Under English law, the verdict belonged to the jury, but it was clear to everyone in the well of the court that the judge considered this a miscarriage of justice. The clerk turned to the dock. "William Herbert Wallace, you stand convicted of willful murder. Have you anything to say why the court should not pass sentence of death upon you according to law?" Wallace drew himself up to his full, skeletal height. He looked directly at the judge, his voice thin, precise, and entirely devoid of any tremor. "I am quite innocent of this charge," Wallace said, his words falling like stones into the quiet room. "The verdict has been given on twisted theories and suspicion, not on facts. I can only say that I am entirely innocent." The judge's marshal stepped forward, placing a small, square piece of black silk, the black cap, upon Justice Wright's wig. The ritual was ancient and terrifying. Justice Wright spoke, his voice unusually low, lacking the grand, resonant authority typical of the sentence. "William Herbert Wallace, the jury has found you guilty of a crime of horrific violence. The law allows me no discretion. The sentence of the court is that you be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and there you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul." "Amen," the chaplain murmured behind the bench. Wallace bowed slightly to the judge, turned, and walked down the stairs into the cells, flanked by 2 towering prison warders. The moment the dock was empty, the courtroom dissolved into absolute chaos. Outside St. George's Hall, the news spread through the waiting thousands like wildfire. A massive, roaring cheer went up from the crowd, the bloodthirsty reaction of a public convinced that the monstrous, naked killer of Anfield had been brought to justice. But inside the defense room, Hector Munro and Schofield Allen were furious. Munro slammed his briefcase onto the table. "It is a perverse verdict. They didn't try the evidence, Sidney. They tried his face. They hung him because he didn't cry at the funeral. We appeal," Schofield Allen hissed, his face pale with rage as he threw his robes aside. "We appeal immediately to the Court of Criminal Appeal in London. Wright's summing up was entirely in our favor. The Crown didn't prove a single thing. We will take this to the highest court in the land, Hector. This farce cannot be allowed to stand. That night, in the condemned cell at Wolverton Jail, Wallace sat on the edge of his iron cot. He was now wearing the rough, heavy canvas clothes of a condemned man, stripped of his respectable grey suit. The executioner would already be calculating his weight and height for the drop. Yet, as he looked at the stone floor, his mind was not on the noose. It was on the 64 squares of a chessboard, tracing the moves of a game where the opponent had broken every rule of logic, leaving him in a checkmate that defied the very laws of reason. Chapter 18. The Lords of the Law. The air inside the Court of Criminal Appeal in London on Monday the 18th of May 1931, was a world away from the emotional cauldron of Liverpool. Here, beneath the vaulted Gothic arches of the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand, there was no public gallery screaming for blood, no dramatic displays of blood-stained raincoats, and no local prejudice. The atmosphere was chilly, academic, and governed entirely by the dry, precise application of statutory law. Three of the country's most formidable legal minds sat on the elevated judicial bench: Lord Chief Justice Hewitt, Mr. Justice Humphreys, and Mr. Justice Branson. Clad in their heavy robes and grey wigs, they looked like ancient statues carved from stone. Before them lay the massive, bound volumes of the Liverpool trial transcripts, thousands of pages of testimony that had sealed the fate of William Herbert Wallace. Under English legal history, the Court of Criminal Appeal was a relatively new institution, and its powers were strictly defined. It was not designed to retry cases or re-evaluate the credibility of witnesses. That was the sacred province of the jury. For an appeal to succeed, the defense usually had to prove a significant error in law by the trial judge or a gross misdirection to the jury. Yet, Sidney Schofield Allen was prepared to launch an attack that was both rare and extraordinarily difficult to sustain. He was going to argue Section 4 of the Criminal Appeal Act, that the verdict of the Liverpool jury was unreasonable and could not be supported having regard to the evidence. "May it please your lordships," Schofield Allen began, standing at the oak podium, his voice echoing in the vast, cavernous hall. "We do not come before this court to complain of the learned trial judge's conduct. Indeed, Mr. Justice Wright's summing up was a masterclass in judicial impartiality, pointing out the immense, insurmountable gaps in the Crown's case. We come here to state that the 12 men of the jury completely abandoned the duty. They did not convict on evidence, my lords. They convicted on a wave of local suspicion and a fundamental dislike of the prisoner's demeanor." Lord Chief Justice Hewitt peered over his spectacles, his expression unreadable. "It is a heavy burden you take upon yourself, Mr. Allen. A jury is entitled to draw inferences from circumstantial evidence. They saw the prisoner. They heard the medical experts. Why should we upset their findings? Because, my lord, the inference they drew is a physical impossibility." Schofield Allen shouted, his combative nature rising to the fore. He leaned forward, tapping his fingers on the bound transcript. "Let us look strictly at the clock. The Crown's case rests upon a microscopic window of time. If we accept the testimony of the milk delivery boy, Alan Close, a witness whom the prosecution themselves called to the stand, Julia Wallace was alive at 25 minutes past 6. Schofield Allen paused, letting the silence settle over the room. The prisoner was verified, beyond any shadow of a doubt, to be on a tramcar miles away at 10 minutes past 7. To get to that tram, he had to leave his house by 25 minutes to 7. That leaves a total of 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, the Crown expects us to believe that this elderly, frail insurance agent conducted a murder of unparalleled ferocity, stripped naked, wore a raincoat, scrubbed his skin and hair entirely free of blood, cleaned a house so thoroughly that the police fingerprint and forensic teams found not a single biological trace in the drains or U-bends, dressed in a clean suit, locked the premises, and walked to his tramcar without showing a single sign of breathlessness or distress to the neighbors he passed. Quote, Mr. Justice Humphreys leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "It is an incredibly tight timeline, Mr. Allen. But the prosecution argued that 5 or 10 minutes is technically sufficient for a calculated mind. A calculated mind cannot bend the laws of chemistry and physics, my lord." Schofield Allen countered fiercely. If a man washes a massive volume of blood down a sink, traces remain. The police pulled the house apart and found nothing. The prosecution did not offer evidence. They offered a gothic romance, a fantasy of a naked killer that belongs in a sensational novel, not a court of king's bench. To hang a man on a timeline where every single second must be accounted for by supernatural speed is a violation of the very principles of British justice. Edward George Hemmard rose to defend the conviction for the Crown, his demeanour far less theatrical than it had been in Liverpool. He knew he was facing a much tougher, more critical audience. "My lords," Hemmard argued, smoothing his silk gown. The jury heard all of these arguments. They weighed the medical testimony of Professor McFall, who placed the death earlier. They saw the blood on the inside of the prisoner's raincoat. They were entitled to conclude that the prisoner, through his long experience as an insurance collector, knew exactly how to manage his time and his movements to create a deceptive alibi. We must not usurp the function of the jury simply because the timeline is narrow. For 2 days, the legal arguments persisted, a cold, clinical dissection of minutes, blood spatter patterns, and the erratic nature of rigor mortis. Wallace himself was not present in the courtroom. He remained in his cell at Wandsworth Prison, waiting in agonizing isolation while the finest minds in the Empire debated the validity of his existence. On the afternoon of Tuesday the 19th of May, the 3 judges returned to the bench after a brief recess. Lord Chief Justice Hewitt adjusted his papers, looked out across the quiet courtroom, and began to read the judgment. "This is a case of unprecedented difficulty," Hewitt stated, his gravelly voice dropping into a solemn cadence. "The court has re-examined the immense volume of evidence with the utmost care. We are fully aware of the sanctity of a jury's verdict, and we do not lightly interfere with the conclusions of 12 ordinary citizens." He turned a page, and Schofield Allen held his breath. "But," Hewitt continued, his eyes locking onto the prosecution table, "the case against the appellant is entirely circumstantial. When we look at the extreme narrowness of the timeline, the complete lack of any weapon, and the absolute absence of any trace of blood on the prisoner or in the drainage system of the house, we are left with a profound sense of dissatisfaction. The law of England requires that a conviction must rest upon certain proof, not on a balance of probabilities or grave suspicion. In the opinion of this court, the case against the appellant was not proved with that certainty which is necessary to justify a verdict of guilty. The appeal is allowed, and the conviction is quashed." A stunned silence fell over the room. For the first time in British legal history, the Court of Criminal Appeal had overturned a willful murder conviction solely on the grounds that the evidence was insufficient to support the jury's verdict. William Herbert Wallace was a free man. The noose had been removed from his neck, and the steel doors of the prison were about to swing open. But as Hector Munro rushed to pack his papers, his face etched with a triumphant smile, he looked back at Schofield Allen. Both men knew that while the lords of the law had granted Wallace his life, they could not grant him his return to the world he had lost. The courtroom battle was won, but the court of public opinion was a far more merciless tribunal. Chapter 19. The Shunned Man. The steel gate of Wandsworth Prison clicked shut behind William Herbert Wallace on the morning of Wednesday the 20th of May 1931. He stepped out onto the London pavement, a free man under the law, yet he felt entirely unmoored. He wore his familiar grey suit, now loose on his severely emaciated frame, and clutched his small suitcase. The noose had been removed from his neck by the highest judges in the land, but as he looked out at the bustling metropolis, there was no joy in his pale, hollow face. The machinery of justice had vindicated him, but it could not give him back his life, his health, or his Julia. Determined to reclaim the quiet respectability that had defined his existence before the nightmare, Wallace boarded the train back to Liverpool. It was a catastrophic error in judgment. When the train pulled into Lime Street Station, the platform was a sea of hostile faces. Word of his release had spread through the city, and the local populace was gripped by a volatile mixture of shock and profound indignation. To the ordinary working-class citizens of Liverpool, a clever lawyer from London had simply found a technical loophole to cheat the gallows for a monster who had butchered an elderly woman in her own parlour. As Wallace's tall, stooped figure stepped off the carriage, a chorus of boos, hisses, and venomous taunts erupted from the crowd. Murderer. A woman screamed from the front row, spitting onto the stone platform near his boots. Naked beast. You should have swung. Where's your raincoat, Wallace? A man roared, his face twisted in disgust. Flanked by a few nervous railway police officers and Hector Munro, who had traveled with him, Wallace walked through the gauntlet of hatred with his head bowed, his spectacles reflecting the flashbulbs of the press photographers. He did not speak. He did not defend himself. He kept his eyes locked onto the ground, his long legs moving with a mechanical, hurried stiffness until he was bundled into the back of a waiting motorcar. The hostility did not end at the station. Wallace discovered that the social fabric of his life had been completely incinerated. When he attempted to return to his duties as an insurance agent for the Prudential Assurance Company, the reaction from his regular Anfield route was immediate and terrifying. The company had stood by him during the trial, but they could not force the public to open the doors. Housewives who had known him for 16 years, women from whom he had collected pennies and shillings with mathematical courtesy, refused to see him. When he walked down the terraced streets, curtains twitched, children whispered, and heavy oak doors slammed shut the moment his shadow fell across the threshold. "We don't want your kind here, Mr. Wallace," one longtime client told him through a narrow crack in her door, her eyes wide with cold fear. "The judges might say what they like, but we know what happened in that parlor. Take your ledger and don't come back." The company was forced to move him to an administrative desk job inside the main office to protect him from physical assault, but even there, the atmosphere was suffocating. His colleagues, men he had worked alongside for decades, fell silent the moment he entered the room. They looked away when he spoke, refusing to sit near him in the cafeteria or share a polite nod in the corridors. He was a ghost walking among the living, a pariah stamped with the invisible, indelible brand of Cain. He could not return to 29 Wolverton Street. The small terraced house remained sealed, a tomb of memories and dark stains that he could not bear to face. He took a small, isolated bungalow named Wildwood, in the semi-rural district of Bromborough, out on the Wirral Peninsula, across the river from the city that hated him. There, in the quiet Cheshire countryside, Wallace sought sanctuary. He spent his days in total, crushing solitude. He tended to his small garden, fed a few chickens, and sat by the fire with his books. He attempted to play chess, setting up the wooden pieces on a table, but the 64 squares offered no comfort now. The game had become a mockery. He had played the most perfect defensive match of his life in the courtroom, proving his timeline with absolute logic, yet the world had still found him guilty. His health, always fragile, began to fail rapidly under the relentless weight of the psychological strain and the bitter isolation. The chronic kidney ailment that had plagued him for years flared up with a vengeance. He grew thinner, his eyes sinking deep into his skull, his hands trembling as he poured his tea. As the winter of 1932 approached, Wallace spent hours staring out the window at the bleak landscape, entirely alone with the silence. He knew his time was short. He had survived the gallows of Walton Jail, but the court of public opinion was executing him anyway, inch by agonizing inch, through the slow, silent poison of total abandonment. The web that had tightened around him in the central cafe was still there, unbreakable and eternal, stretching from the streets of Anfield to the quiet shores of the Wirral, ensuring that William Herbert Wallace would never truly be a free man until he was beneath the earth. Chapter 20. The Final Checkmate. The winter of 1933 arrived with a harsh, damp frost that settled heavily over the Wirral Peninsula. Inside the small bungalow in Bromborough, William Herbert Wallace lay in his bed, his body completely spent. The kidney disease that had plagued his adult life had reached its terminal phase, exacerbated by 2 years of relentless stress, public hatred, and the crushing weight of grief. He was 54 years old, but he looked like an octogenarian, his skin the color of old parchment and his breathing shallow and rattling. There were no crowds outside his window now, no photographers, and no screaming voices. There was only the quiet tick of his silver pocket watch on the bedside table, the same timepiece that had once measured his frantic, impossible minutes in Mossley Hill. As the hours drifted toward the end, Wallace's mind began to slip between the present and the past. He was no longer in the quiet Cheshire countryside, he was back in the narrow hallway of 29 Wolverton Street, watching Julia wrap a woolen scarf around his neck. He was back in the basement of the Central Cafe, holding a chess piece between his fingers, listening to Samuel Beatty recite the message that had rewritten his destiny. Qualtrough, he whispered into the empty room, the name cracking on his dry lips. For 2 years, that name had been the central enigma of his existence. The police had claimed it was a mirror, a fiction he had invented to hide his own dark impulses. But Wallace knew the truth. Qualtrough was a real person, a flesh-and-blood shadow who had walked the streets of Liverpool, dropped pennies into the Anfield phone box, and known exactly how to weaponize Wallace's precise habits against him. In his final months, Wallace had often thought of a specific young man, a former prudential clerk he had known, a man with a reputation for financial recklessness and a desperate need for cash, someone who had known the collection routes, knew the chess club schedule, and had a voice smooth enough to fool a captain. Wallace had shared his suspicions with Hector Munro, but without physical evidence, the name could never be spoken aloud in a court of law. The police had closed their ledgers the moment Wallace was arrested, refusing to pursue any other path, leaving the real architect of the nightmare to vanish into the foggy history of the city. It was the ultimate, cruel irony of the game. The killer had achieved a perfect checkmate. By framing Wallace, they had not only escaped the gallows but had ensured that Wallace would be utterly destroyed by the very society he had served so faithfully. On the morning of Tuesday, the 7th of February 1933, the long battle finally came to an end. William Herbert Wallace drew his last breath, passing away in relative obscurity, his hand resting near the silver watch that had governed his life. A few days later, a small, somber group gathered at Anfield Cemetery. There were no grand speeches, no weeping crowds, only a handful of loyal friends from the chess club and the Prudential who still believed in his innocence, standing under black umbrellas against a grey, drizzling sky. Wallace was laid to rest in the very same plot as his beloved Julia. In death, at least, the isolation was over, and they were reunited beneath the cold Lancashire soil, far beyond the reach of the courtroom benches and the vicious gossip of the terraced streets. The file on the Anfield parlour murder was placed into the archives of the Liverpool City Police, stamped forever with a word that gave the detectives no comfort: unsolved. As the years rolled into decades, the red brick terraces of Wolverton Street would remain, the Central Cafe would close its doors, and the red telephone kiosk on Anfield Road would be replaced, but the mystery would endure, frozen in time. It remains a masterclass in human ambiguity, a story where every fact can be argued in two opposite directions, where the timeline is both a shield of innocence and a weapon of guilt, and where the identity of the true killer remains locked in the dark parlor of history. William Herbert Wallace had stepped off the stage, taking his secrets, his innocence, and his quiet compliance into the absolute silence of the grave, leaving behind a chessboard where the final pieces would never, ever be swept away.